Howdy folks, Shell Presto here. Today we're going to do the cheap art supply challenge. I got this 68-piece Tiny Crafts portable art studio for a whopping $3 on Black Friday at Michael's. I believe it was reduced from $5 or $6 normal price. So yeah, these are definitely quality art supplies. They're for ages 6+. You've got 12 crayons, 12 oil pastels, 12 color markers, 12 color pencils, 12 watercolor cakes, a tube of white paint, a paintbrush, a palette, a pencil, an eraser, a sharpener, a ruler, and a case that the whole thing comes in. I was mildly excited when I picked this up because it came with what I thought was this palette. So this palette here is actually my favorite watercolor palette. It's hard plastic. It came in a kit similar to this, but I think it may have been a slightly more expensive one, and I will tell you why. This is not my first time opening this. I actually opened it up because I needed the ruler, but I was very disappointed when I did, because when I opened it up, I thought for $3 I was getting my favorite cheap watercolor palette again, but I was very disappointed because when I actually checked, it looks remarkably similar, and it's not the lack of slots up here that make it worse. I wouldn't care if it was just these two slots, but this is flimsy, bendable plastic, so it's not doing me any good. Although if I use the watercolors in this challenge, I will use this. But yeah, this one's nice hard plastic. I need to find another one of these. Alright, so I restored the case to what it looked like previously. And you're going to hear me talk about doing the challenge, but I have actually already done it. But I'll let you know what I worked with. So, I really like this ruler at least, so I spent $3 and got a nice clear ruler, so that's cool. And that's actually going in my regular art kit. You can probably tell I did not use the watercolors. But if you want me to make a video using those watercolors, I absolutely will. Okay, so what tools did I use? I used the colored pencils, and actually I used the markers as well. So this is what we're working with. And I will let you know about my disappointment in advance. This black marker doesn't work. And you can hear my cat in the background. Oh well, that's Algernon. But yeah, the black marker did not work. So yeah, it was actually 11 markers and 12 colored pencils. I do have the crayons and the oil pastels and the watercolors, which I did not test. If you guys like this challenge and want me to go ahead and do more using this kit, just leave a bunch of comments. So, alright, on to the challenge. I almost forgot to mention, so a lot of people when they do these challenges, they use printer paper or cardstock. And I had a feeling I was going to use the markers, and I ended up using the markers, so I didn't want to do it on printer paper. And I had the ominous, let's be honest and say realistic, thought in my head that the colored pencils were not going to be so hot, and that pressure wasn't going to change much in terms of getting them to grip the paper, and I was correct. So going into it, I decided I wanted to use paper with texture. So the pad that I ended up using, I got from Hobby Lobby. It says $2.99 on it, but it was actually either $1.50 or $1.70. It's one of those Master's Touch Fine Art Studio, which is their store brand, which means that these are the cheapest things they have. And since it's a small 6x6 tablet, it was an affordable price. So at we'll say it was $1.50. There's 12 sheets. That's slightly more than 10 cents a sheet. So, cheapest watercolor paper I could find. It's even cheaper than the stuff I could find in Walmart. So, that's what we ended up using. So, a little bit of tooth and texture to it. Alright, on with the show. So right off the bat, I had a bad feeling about these colored pencils. They were waxy. Not crayon waxy, but filler instead of pigment waxy. As the piece progresses, I assure you that I was pressing as hard as I could with these things in the shadows, and the darkest tones that I got were pastel at best. But that's the joy of these kits. I had colored pencils that were too light, sure, but I had other supplies that alone had limited range, but when combined with the other mediums, had all the might of Voltron, or Dinozord, or Captain Planet. Okay, the art supplies weren't all that mighty, but that's still the main takeaway I hope you get from this video. Don't be afraid to mix your supplies to make up for the shortcomings of one medium. These colored pencils could only give me light tones, but the markers, while only capable of giving me one straight mid or dark tone, gave me a near complete range of tones from dark to light when combined with the colored pencils. There were definitely some midtones missing. There are no smooth gradients in this piece. But considering one of the biggest tells that a piece is from an amateur is a lack of contrast, missing midtones isn't as bad as missing lights or darks. You see, if the picture doesn't have a good range of dark and light values, if you don't see, I won't say a bright white and the darkest black, but that's a good example. Let's say a pretty darn light color or value and a pretty darn dark color or value in the same piece. That piece isn't going to look as polished. There are things you can do without using light or dark tones to add contrast, like using complementary colors and things like that, but that is a different discussion. Anyway, by mixing your media, you can ensure you get that full range. If you only have Crayola or Rose Art colored pencils or crayons, use their markers too. If you only have Crayola or Prang watercolors and you can't get dark colors out of them, use markers with them, or mix in a few dark folk art acrylic paints. And likewise, if you only have dark mediums, really cheap colored pencils can balance those out and give you light tones. If you fine folks are wondering who we're drawing here, it's not Corona in a shawl. I did count the other day and found out that I've done finished pieces of artwork of about 70 different characters in our Ascension Epoch universe. So with that said, I was bound to end up with 2 female redheads with green eyes. These characters are a bit more blue-green, and if anyone is counting, I've actually got quite a few male redheads too. Anyway, this character's name is Caitlin Phylan, and she will eventually appear in our Martian War Chronicles book series. I say eventually because of all the characters I've drawn so far, it looks like anything starring her is quite a ways off. But I've been jonesing to draw her for a while now. I played her in a tabletop role-playing game with my husband and a darn good friend of ours. I took notes and recorded the sessions, so that'll turn into a book in the future. And it made the weekends really fun. This piece came about because I actually stopped in the middle of a much more realistic watercolor piece featuring a much more exciting pose because, and this happens to me a lot, I dove into a more complex piece with no idea what the character was wearing. This is pretty easy to do, since it's best to lay out and do construction lines on a figure drawing that's not wearing clothes, because how are you going to know where the legs are if you don't draw them first and then put the skirt over them? I was tempted to wing it and toss together any outfit on that bigger piece, but then I stopped myself, told myself I was being foolish and I was going to screw it up, and then made myself sit down, look up some working woman's clothes from the late 1800s, and focus on that. You only see her shawl and brooch here, but know that I did work out what type of dress she usually wears too. Anyway, the thing about Caitlin that becomes most relevant to the picture relates to the background. I was at a loss for the background. I wanted something dark, since Caitlin was so light with the colored pencils. A dark background would make her pop and make it seem like her being so light was intentional instead of, you know, the art supply's fault. But since I couldn't layer the markers, they were rubbing away at the paper something fierce, and the tips were so big and round I didn't feel comfortable going for, say, a landscape or a cabin or anything that should be soft and organic. And Lord knows, there were not going to be any soft gradients if I put, say, a sunset behind her or the moon just starting to rise. Caitlin has telekinesis. She can move things with her mind, violently. If you ask her to use her powers to pass along your coffee cup, you better duck, because the table is coming with it, and fast. But she's also psychic. Not in the telepathic sense. The odd collection of Martian war heroes aren't using her as a communicator. She can't read or project her thoughts, but she has a very strong eerie sense. She can feel intangible things like ghosts or fairies or ley lines. And she has ridiculously vivid dreams that are often insightful and sometimes prophetic. So knowing what I had to work with and wanting to give a sense of her powers instead of going with a, say, realistic landscape in the background, I decided to go full-on Professor X-style psychic waves in the background. I like how they turned out, but I also feared that with the lack of gradients and limited colors, that having just the blue waves alone looked a little like a chrysanthemum flower instead of energy effects. To really hammer it home, I added some hot pink speed lines, which layered with the blue nicer than I expected to make a neat looking purple. However, doing that really tore up the paper. Then to break up the pattern of the blue waves a bit, I added pink lightning effects. I didn't like my color choices. I mean, I liked the choices I made with the limited options, I just didn't like the limited options. I didn't want yellow lightning because that would seem elemental, and she doesn't control lightning. Pink seemed more abstract, and it was one of the brighter colors I had to work with. I think ideally I would have used either something more like a bright bluish purple or a teal to make the psychic lightning, but those weren't in my choices. In the end, the colors of the background clash with Caitlin, but at least in doing so she stands out. And the entire palette doesn't go with the usually muted colors I associate with our Martian War Chronicles stories in my mind. But you work with what you've got. That's what these challenges are all about. I guess the only other thing to say is that I'm sort of glad that these markers weren't thin enough to ink this picture with. Using any sort of pressure or doubling over a line tore up the paper something fierce, and the tips weren't fine enough for any small details. But had they been fine, I might have gone in with a black marker to put some lines in, only to have it turn streaky, have some black on the page that stood out like a sore thumb, and not had any other black anywhere in the piece. You can see me struggling to get out just my signature with that black marker at the end. I do try to limit using black when I'm not straight up inking a piece. And I knew that I'd be fighting the supplies to get quality shading, so I thought the piece would look better if I tried to use colored lines instead of black. I don't even use the black colored pencil anywhere in here. And I think that decision paid off. I think this looks pretty good. Not off the wall fantastic, but definitely solid. I ain't gonna lie and say, this is the best piece. See, you can make a masterpiece with cheap art supplies. But I will say this. This looks pretty good, and I spent $4.50 total on enough supplies that I'm sure would fill all 12 pages of this watercolor pad and then some. Except for that black marker, which doesn't work. I will say that you can get a 10-pack of 2B pencils or ballpoint pens for less than $2. which puts them at 20 cents a piece, and make artwork that is jaw-droppingly beautiful. Better than this. So, an art case like this may actually be overspending if you're looking for the best quality of cheapest art supplies. Crayola is definitely a step up as far as cheap art supplies go, but this is a fun little kit to play around with for kicks. And I do think I proved that you can get something pretty good out of dirt cheap art supplies. So what are your favorite cheap art supplies? Please let me know in the comments, especially if you want me to take a crack at drawing with them. Mine are actually those big packs of Papermate colored ballpoint pens on Post-it notes. I was on a stint where I did 20 or 30 of them back in probably around 2014, and that was a blast. Let me know what your favorite cheap supplies are in the comments, and if you'd like to see me use them or anything else in future challenges. Also, if you like steampunk or Wild West short stories or fairy tales, you may want to hop over to ascensionepoch.com or Amazon and check out our short story collection, Martian War Chronicles: Population of Loss. Caitlin doesn't appear in it, but there are other awesome heroes within. And of course, purchasing a book helps this channel. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like or thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see future videos by me. Most importantly of all though, have an awesome day. Presto, over and out. Hey, you're still here. Very cool. So let's look at some other cheap art supply artwork. I mentioned that I love using ballpoint pen on Post-it notes. These top 3 images of Cyclone Ranger, the Fae, and Signalman were done for the Martian War Chronicles short story book I spoke about before. And the bottom one is one of my favorite Post-it note artworks that I've ever done. And I think it really speaks to the idea that even cheap art supplies can create something fabulous. She's a character called Quiver from the Archer's book series. I did use a white gel pen in all of these, and one Prismacolor marker for a flat night sky on Quiver. This piece here was done with student grade art supplies, 1 HB and 1 2B pencil. I don't fully render things out in pencil very often, but pencils are cheap and can give jaw-dropping results. Not that this is jaw-dropping, but I'm just saying, I've seen people do amazing things with just a pencil. It's Ozma again, if you remember her from previous pieces I've shown. In her superhero persona, the Emerald Witch, a public domain redesign of the character from the Wizard of Oz books. I tinted the pencils green on the computer because, well, Oz and the Emerald City and whatnot. But this was done entirely in pencil. In one of my previous after credit scenes, the one in the public domain redesign of Dart, I showed a high heel I rendered in pencil, and that would be jaw-dropping, if it wasn't of a shoe. I still love me a good still life, but I prefer art that tells a story. I also have a fantastic drawing of an ear of corn from high school if you folks want me to dig out my portfolio one day. No, I was being serious. The corn looks great. Hey, come back.